And welcome back. Now I'm afraid this talk is going to be a little bit more challenging both for me and for you, because I have to talk about 3 different ways of applying smoothing operations over the whole track, or they will work generally on part of a track. We have centroid averaging Bezier splines in 2 forms, one that goes through the existing points and one that does not. And firstly, I'm going to explain what they do, and then secondly, we're going to look at a more realistic example. I deliberately simplified this track to create some fairly obvious triangles. I'm going to begin with centroid averaging. If you visualize, say, this track point up here, think of its 2 neighbors forming a triangle, and imagine where that triangle would balance on the point of your finger, so somewhere in the middle about there. It will move that track point towards that middle point. The extent to which it moves it depends on how much I set the smoothing slider here. And then this next track point here, think of the next triangle, estimate where its centroid is, which is kind of the middle in a non-technical sense of the triangle, so that track point will move inwards. This track point will move that way, and so on. So it will bring in the radius of the bends a bit, but it does produce a fairly smooth effect overall. Let's just do that. So that's with a 50% smoothing, 100% smoothing, or indeed almost no smoothing at all. Now if I pack the smoothing all the way up and do that a few times, it will quite quickly remove all the detail and turn that into an amoeba. It can be a way of creating interesting organic shapes if you're that way inclined. Okay, differently, Bezier splines that pass through existing points. Imagine perhaps each track point is a post in the ground with a hoop in the top, and you have a steel wire and you thread it through the tops of those points and then you pull it tight. That's effectively what you get with a Bezier spline. Tension is the extent to which you pull that steel wire tight, and tolerance is how closely we put the track points in to estimate the position of that steel wire. So if we look at that corner where the pointer is, and you will now see we've added additional control points either side of each of the corners to make that flow a bit more smoothly. That becomes perhaps clearer if we make the tolerance a bit finer. And it will, because it's going through the track points, it will sometimes introduce perhaps deviations that you didn't particularly expect in order to get a smooth rate of change of curvature as it goes around the track. That's Bezier splines that passes through the track points. Bezier splines that uses the track points will tend to cut the corners more, so it doesn't attempt to pass through these points. It uses them as guide points to create a smooth track, and this will also bring in the radius of the bend, but produces results that are quite different to the centroid filter. And you can do that a couple of times, but it doesn't really make much difference after you've done it once, which is quite different to the averaging. Now, these in real life can be quite effective. So let me just go and find a particularly noisy track that you may have seen before if you've been watching the whole series. Okay, so we can compare and contrast at this point the centroid average. I could apply that to position and elevation, and that will fairly aggressively smooth the whole track. And see, it makes a fairly good job of the dips and the hairpins, but it will lose position on the bends. And if I keep doing that, the hairpins will disappear entirely. Some people like to work independently in terms of position and elevation, so I could apply that just to the elevation and use that as a way of smoothing out the dips, but you can see that that is still bringing in the, sorry, that's the position. So changing the position is changing the shape of the road on the map, and by bringing points closer together, it does have an impact on the gradients as well. The other option to take there is to just say, well, let's just try and smooth the elevations and not worry about the position, and that's quite effective on the hairpins and the dips, and it does, as you can see, keep the radius of the hairpins where they should be. That's the centroid averaging in this particular case. That's quite effective at smoothing. The Bezier splines passing through existing points is really not a good application for this, because it will try and thread that steel wire through each of these points, and regardless of how tight you pull it, it will not necessarily make a very good job. And in fact, unless I bring the tolerance really down or low, it does nothing useful at all. And therefore it's more appropriate when you have not very many track points and you want to create a smooth flow between them. It's not very effective when you already have a large number of track points. Differently though, using the existing points as an approximation is actually kind of in between the centroid averaging as a effectiveness, so it does have some smoothing effect in both the plane and in the elevation, and therefore is quite good if you want pleasing quick results. The only way to find out what's appropriate in each situation, frankly, is to try it yourself and see which one works best. That wasn't as long as I thought it was going to be, so I hope that was okay. Thank you very much.